So I'd like to start with a little introduction. Could you tell us a little bit of who you are and what you do?
So I'm Theresa McClenaghan, and I'm a lawyer and executive director at the Canadian Environmental Law Association.
So for fun, you're working in another degree. Could you
am.
tell us a little bit about that?
In my spare time, for fun, I'm doing a degree in geology to finish my undergrad degree. So I went to law school with just 2 years of undergrad, and I promised myself that someday I'd go back and do that. So I'm doing a geology degree at Western and just about to go on a field trip this spring to Arizona and Utah to study planetary science.
You're also a writer and you're working in a book. Could you give us a little preview of what you're working on that?
So I am an author of the book Ontario Water Law with my co-author Julie Abashar, another lawyer. It's been published for about 3 years now, and we update it twice a year, which is quite a big undertaking, a real labor of love. It's really meant for people who work in detail with water law issues, people who manage water, to understand the case law and the law around water. And I do write book chapters for other environmental law publications as well, and the odd other publication.
Well, many of the people in the clinic system struggle to find a balance between personal life and work. Could you tell us how you do that?
Well, I don't do that. I don't find a balance between life and work. There's no such thing. But I've sort of come to terms with the way I can make it work for myself and my family, and I try very hard to protect my weekends. That is not always possible depending on what's going on, but that's what I try to do. And then during the week, it's just a free-for-all. I'm, morning till night. I have long days commuting. And right into the evening, I'm still checking email or working on something for the next day if I need to be. But that's kind of my trade-off, is I try to protect the weekends and have real quality time at home.
You mentioned Dr. Rosalie Bertel as your role model. Could you tell us what she did or a little bit more about her and what stayed with you?
Dr. Rosalie Bertel is very well known in the environmental community in Ontario and in the nuclear activist community as well. I had the privilege of acting for her as a client in a piece of litigation against the nuclear industry in the late 80s and early 90s, and then worked with her on a number of things over the years. She was a nun who went back to school and became an epidemiologist, and she learned about the consequences of Chernobyl and other radiation health hazards, and was fearless in advocating for vulnerable people about the hazards of nuclear radiation.
How was your path to the clinic system?
Well, I did work in the clinic system in law school. I was in the SLAS at Western, both as a second-year student and then as a supervising lawyer in third year, and really appreciated the clinical experience there that I gained in a whole range of different kinds of casework and tribunals. And then once I became intent on litigation, I knew I wanted to do environmental law, so I started in private practice and built up an environmental practice working for small citizens groups and for First Nation clients, and went through a couple different mergers of law firms, and the opportunity arose to join CELA, who I knew well, as counsel on some of my files, and I was very pleased to be successful in applying for one of the rare jobs that ever comes up at CELA as a full-time lawyer, and that was in 1998.
So let's talk about CELA for a minute, because I think a lot of people don't understand what CELA does. Could you tell us a little bit about your work in CELA?
CELA is almost 50 years old. We were formed in 1970 at the U of T to help advance environmental cases, and then we became funded as a clinic in the mid-70s, and we were one of the first specialty clinics ever funded back when they were running pilots and trying to figure out the scope of the legal aid clinic system itself. And we were featured in one of the early reports in the 70s as an essential aspect of social justice law. The work we do is with a lens to look at the impacts of environmental law on vulnerable communities or where there's a big power differential. So a small community next to a polluting factory, for example, might be the kind of community we would represent, or the community of Walkerton, who suffered the terrible tragedy of the contaminated drinking water And so we do that kind of work. We do systemic work. We work with other clinics, which we're constantly doing more of. For example, we're running a big project right now about tenant indoor environmental health, and we tie together our law reform work and our case work to look at whether people are properly protected from pesticides, for example, or from lead or from other toxic chemicals.
The Walkerton Inquiry and the recommendations for the Clean Water Act were a big part of your work. Could you tell us a little bit of what you did there and how was being involved in that?
Well, the Walkerton Inquiry was a true tragedy because from treated, or we thought treated, municipal drinking water that became contaminated in a big rainfall event, 7 people in that community died, one of whom was an infant. And it was a big shock to Ontario and to the international community that could happen. People didn't appreciate that groundwater could be contaminated. We had already been calling for a Safe Drinking Water Act since the 1970s, and I personally then took forward the push for source water protection with the involvement of many, many people, and I worked on that not only during the inquiry, but in the second phase of the inquiry on law reform efforts with provincial advisory panels. I eventually joined the minister's office for a couple of years to help implement the rest of the Walkerton recommendations and get that act passed. And then I came back to CELA and continued making sure it was implemented well, which we continue to do. And we think there's a lot of room to improve, but we also acknowledge Ontario now has one of the best systems for municipal drinking water anywhere.
You have played an important part in the development of the co-op. Could you tell us a little bit of the evolution of your idea for the co-op from the beginning of the project to what the co-op is now?
I think from the beginning, it first came up as an idea at a meeting of specialty clinics with our then VP soon after I became ED at CELA in 2007. And at that meeting, we were trying to come up with ways to work together. And we had a whole bunch of ideas on the table. Doing more work elsewhere in the province, accessing statistics together. But one of the ideas was, were there ways we could share more facilities? And then administrative savings came along a couple of years later, and the specialty clinics decided that our focus would be to see whether co-location could be a way to arrive at those types of efficiencies. But as we started to talk among ourselves, it quickly became evident that the opportunity for collaboration would be the real vision of the project, and the administrative savings and those kinds of efficiencies would be nice, but the real benefit would be the opportunity to work together much more even than we already did. Some of us already did some of that, and as we carried on with different visioning exercises and had project managers walk us through that and look at what it could look like, that really became the driving effort. We were definitely sidetracked for a while around logistics and finding the space, but I think the collaboration remains the driving vision for all of us, and we constantly find new ways to do that.
And you mentioned you're interested in the collaborative social justice work that the co-op allows you to do, and that you see some connections between the different clinics areas. Could you give us some example of interrelated work that's already happening, and talk about some possibilities that could potentially become interesting work?
Well, for example, one of the things we had been doing that's been continuing and growing is the low-income energy network. And that arose more than 15 years ago when we realized that CELA was advocating certain solutions for energy poverty, and ACTA was advocating certain solutions for energy poverty, and ISAC as well, and that we really needed to bring those lenses together and have a unified voice for the environment and for low-income communities, and that's what we've done ever since to great success. Another example that has begun mostly since we've been here is the Rent Safe project, and that's a project that Kathy Cooper, one of our paralegals, leads, looking at indoor environmental health, mold, pesticides, lead, fresh air exchange, secondhand smoke, and looking at the barriers to tenants, achieving safe indoor health and what the legal avenues could be. Another example that we've done for a long time is working on the environmental side of occupational health issues. So we work a lot and have for years on toxic chemicals and standard setting, and then we reach out and we work with some of the clinics who work on worker safety and occupational health to advocate together for phasing out a particular hazardous chemical, for example, like asbestos.
A quality you value in a person.
Integrity.
One thing that motivates you.
Health.
One of your strengths.
Persistence.
Your weakness.
Thoroughness.
Are you a hunter or a gatherer?
Gatherer.
Are you a loner or a people person?
People person.
A song that you've been listening to, or maybe a radio station?
Hallelujah.
What's the book you're reading right now?
I'm reading an interesting book called Gut by a German microbiologist.
What animal would you be if you could be an animal?
A loon.
Would you prefer winter, fall, spring, or summer?
Oh, all of them.
If you were to choose another country to live in, which one would it be?
Iceland.
What would you do if you won the lottery?
Travel.
What do you do when you're commuting? I know you commute a lot for a long time. What?
I work. I drink tea and I work.
Well, this might be longer. If you were stuck in the elevator with Justin Trudeau, what would you say to him or do?
We live in a federation, Justin. You have to get along with the other jurisdictions.
Okay, good. Very nice. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good. That was short and sweet.